listening to the World Soccer Talk podcast, the only podcast about watching soccer on TV and online. Welcome to episode 162. Coming up on this week's show, soccer watching behind closed doors, the Premier League breaks a new US TV record, a major soccer competition goes pay-per-view, how the coronavirus could change soccer as we know it, plus we have letters from you, the listeners, in our mailbag section. I'm Christopher Harris, aka The Gaffer, and I'm joined alongside my co-host Kartik Krishnaiyer. Kartik and I are back on Skype this week. Last week we had the good fortune of recording this podcast in the studios at Tuduene, which was a great experience. And Kartik this week had a story about Zona football and the Europa League and UEFA Champions League. That's at worldsoccertalk.com. But Kartik, let's dive in. This is going to be a different episode than we've ever done before in terms of the subject material. 6 months ago, this is something we would have never thought of in terms of what's going on with the coronavirus and the impact that it's having on our TV viewing experience. From this past week, not as much of an impact, slight impact here and there with some games being played behind closed doors. Next week, ongoing, it's going to have a more dramatic impact. As recording this Thursday morning, La Liga's announced the next 2 weeks are suspended. Serie A has already announced basically the next month has been suspended. And we're expecting other leagues to announce things accordingly. So by the time you listen to this podcast, might be a little bit out of date, but we're going to keep it as fresh as possible. Kartik, before we dive into the whole coronavirus and everything that's been happening, U.S. women's national team, this is a big game on Wednesday evening. They played Japan in the final game of the tournament. They went ahead and won it. They needed a draw to win the competition to be safe, but they won it. But I missed this game. I was watching, I can't remember what I was watching. I was watching something else, but so much going on. But what happened at halftime?
So at halftime, Seb Salazar, who's the commentator and who has one of the few people in the U.S. media who on television who has consistently been willing to take on U.S. soccer, and this goes back to 2016, 2017. Seb and his co-commentator Julie Foudy have a very frank and
refreshing,
honest discussion about U.S. soccer regarding the depositions and what we've now found from the discovery phase of the U.S. women's national team equality lawsuit, I should say, not necessarily equal pay, that it has made the rounds the last few days, and it has been absolutely beyond damaging to the brand of U.S. soccer. This looks like an organization, and I think most of our listeners would agree, that looks not only misogynistic, but just completely tone deaf as to the realities of society in the 2015 to 2020 time period, as well as the actual realities of soccer in this country or in this region. And quite frankly, Chris, I mean, one of the things I pointed out the last few days since all of this broke was that the general excuse making we see about the U.S. men's national team from Federation apologists, MLS apologists, and people who defend the men's national team at all turns, all ended up in these legal pleadings. So that's why I know it wasn't just the lawyers took it in a certain direction, which is the fallback position now. These are the same talking points that had been thrown at people like me for years when I criticized the men's national team performances, and they've ended up in talking points in a deposition in this lawsuit. So Salazar and Foudy go after Carlos Cordero, who's the president of U.S. Soccer, and U.S. Soccer's attorneys. By full time, so we hit stoppage time, 90th minute. I think there were 2 or 3 minutes of stoppage time. It's 3-1 U.S. at this point. It's been a good game. Japan has played well, but the U.S. goals came mostly off of defensive errors from Japan, which the U.S., in the ruthless fashion they play, pounced on. Salazar's handed a statement by the producer. He hasn't seen the statement. He reads it on air, Chris, for the first time. And Julie Foudy, who is, as I mentioned, is his co-commentator, just sits and says, I'm going to take this in for a minute or two, Seb. And then when she regained her composure, she was very diplomatic. Well, not diplomatic. She was very professional, I would say, in her response to Cordero's incredulous statement, which was that these depositions, what we've seen in the news, they don't reflect the values of U.S. soccer as an organization, when, of course, what I've just said 2 minutes ago, Chris, and everyone else is saying similar things, including Julie Foudy, it absolutely does reflect the values of U.S. soccer and the way that they've conducted themselves over the course of the last decade or more. So absolutely incredulous. That statement made matters worse. And the fact that that statement was given before full time of this match leads me to believe potentially U.S. soccer panicked at the halftime discussion on the air of one of their rights holders and decided that they were going to try and correct the record from their perspective without properly vetting the statement. And it's just caused more trouble.
Right. And while I have complete respect for Seb Salazar, Julie Foudy, ESPN, and many others within the industry, personally, I don't think it was the halftime. I mean, I didn't see it, but I don't think it was the halftime analysis or against Cordero that went ahead and caused Cordero and US Soccer to issue the statement to essentially apologize for some of the offending remarks that have been made in the last week's court filing. What I think it was, Kartik, was Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola had earlier in the day gone out and said, "Hey, we're not in agreement with these things that are being said. This is not the way that we feel." And as we saw back even with FIFA and Sepp Blatter, it was once the sponsors started pulling out and sponsors started saying things publicly, that was the beginning of the end for Sepp Blatter. Carlos Cordero, this could be the beginning of the end for him in terms of really, you got Coca-Cola. If there were other sponsors that came out too that said, hey, we're not really happy right now with US Soccer Federation in terms of the things they're saying, in terms of all these lawsuits they're involved in. It's a bad look for the US Soccer Federation, no matter if you agree with some of the things that they're doing or disagree. It's a complete mess. They're very disorganized, poor communication skills, and this is not a good look for soccer. But going back to the show and what we focus on, which is the TV coverage. Go ahead.
On Coca-Cola, you're probably right. Now that I think about it, there is a historic precedence for this in U.S. history, which is 1964. Martin Luther King Jr. gets awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Coca-Cola, as I think probably everybody knows, is from Atlanta.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King lives in Atlanta. Atlanta is at the time in the capital of Georgia, which is a very conservative, segregationist state run by segregationist Democrats. Coca-Cola, when Martin Luther King won this Nobel Peace Prize, the city of Atlanta was not going to honor Martin Luther King. Coca-Cola threatened the mayor and the city commission and basically said, if you don't honor him, we can pick up and leave and move our headquarters to New York or wherever, Chicago, wherever. And it was such a strong statement from Atlanta's largest employer, private employer, that they relented and they had a big banquet honoring Martin Luther King. And it ended up being kind of the segue to integrate the city of Atlanta in a more meaningful way. So Coca-Cola has and this is a similar issue, right? This is a similar equality issue. Has for many years taken a strong, aggressive stand on this and are willing to stand up and be counted. So since you mentioned that, my mind turned to the 1960s and realized, social movements Coca-Cola usually is at the forefront of, and you're right, they probably reached out to Cordero and said, this is unacceptable. We're going to pull our sponsorship or do something, or threaten to pull it.
In 2015, Coca-Cola called for Sepp Blatter to be released, to be effectively to step down. And that's the power that a global sponsor has with federations and with confederations, where they're pumping in millions of dollars of sponsor dollars into organizations. And if they don't agree with what's happening, that can have a massive impact. And for them, Coca-Cola, to come out publicly. I mean, the story Wednesday was on the front page of the BBC. I mean, it went global. So So I think it was definitely ESPN having the game live, having that exposure. You mean, if the US Soccer Federation was going to say anything and apologize, that was probably the perfect vehicle to do so on, just in terms of getting the word out there. But it's still, I don't know, it hasn't resolved anything. It hasn't, it might have maybe given Coca-Cola some time or something to think about in terms of at least they're coming out to apologize for those comments that have been made. But what a mess, Kartik. But so speaking of what a mess, I mean, this Kartik, can you remember before? I mean, obviously before this last week or so, either attending a game or watching a game that's been played behind closed doors, just in your history of watching soccer on TV in the past?
Yeah, I've actually had the privilege of attending a couple of closed-door friendlies that were weird. So there was a friendly between the Fort Lauderdale Strikers and New York Red Bulls one year. Now, one year we opened the stadium very late when those two teams played, and Thierry Henry by that time was with the Red Bulls. So 3,000 or 4,000 people showed up, shockingly, with like 48 hours notice. I think you remember that, Chris. Yep. But there was another year we, the Strikers, played the Red Bulls with an empty in a closed-door friendly at Lockhart Stadium when it was raining, and I had told the supporters group, hey, it's closed door, you can come. And you have this huge stadium, 20,000 seats. I think obviously it's now been rebuilt for the MLS team, but at the time, actually 18,000 seats empty for, a game between an MLS team and an NASL team. It was very, very weird, even though it wasn't due to any virus or anything. It was because the Red Bulls were playing in the CONCACAF Champions League, and they wanted a high-level friendly before they went to Central America or Mexico, and they didn't want anyone to scout it, right? Mm-hmm. So we closed the doors, and played the game. So that was my only experience within a big stadium. I've been to some other closed-door friendlies that have been held in smaller venues. I've remembered watching some games in Europa League where the stadium was closed due to racism or other things. However, I think it was surreal watching the Derby d'Italia on Sunday.
Yep.
With closed doors. Then PSG Dortmund was I thought just as incredibly weird. Although, Chris, I have to say, you can debate whether this helps or hurts teams, because I feel like PSG is such a poison chalice now. Not having the crowd there may have helped them play really well against Dortmund, because there wasn't that external pressure. But we're entering an era, and I want to mention this before we move on to the other news. I think we're entering an era where we're going to need to get used to this for the next month, 2, 3, and there are solutions that are going to have to be made. I think the chances are a lot of things are going to get postponed or canceled, like Serie A and La Liga. There are other areas where matches will be played, but we're going to have Schalke Dortmund, which that is when it's going to really hit home. That's this weekend. That's being played in front of played. Yeah, and that's two of the teams with the most passionate fan bases in the world playing in a derby.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other story, because that game's not on FS1. It's not on FS2. That one's on Fox Soccer Plus. So, to be honest with you, I think very few people would be watching that from the US anyway. I mean, you would, I would probably too, but I mean, very few people get Fox Soccer Plus. But that's a whole other story. But that's the thing, though, Kartik, is that watching the games. I mean, the Atalanta against Valencia, the PSG Dortmund game, the Serie A games over this past weekend, I didn't get a chance to watch. But for me, part of the game of soccer, a large part of the game of soccer, is the fans. And without those fans in the stadium, it's not the same. Without the atmosphere, without the singing, without the banter, without all those things, it's amazing how much of an impact the fans have on the viewing experience. So whether it's flags waving, whether it's tifos, whether it's just crowd shots and bringing you into the game, making you feel that these people are just like you could be there too. It does make an impact psychologically when you're watching a game. It pulls you closer into the broadcast. Without that, and I know you were mentioning too, Kartik, that we have to get used to that. I don't know. To me, I mean, even some of these big games that are going to be behind closed doors, I will watch them, but I think I'm the rarity. I think most people would not watch these games unless it's maybe a Champions League game. And the issue is that where we're at today with soccer globally is if any games are being played behind closed doors, it's really for contractual reasons. I don't think most of the players want to be there. You mean the clubs don't want to play some of these games? I think they'd rather say, let's suspend these games, let's take a break, and then let's come back once we know that everything is all clear, however long that's going to take. But I just think that playing behind closed doors is not a good move unless it's. Unless these games like next week in the Champions League, and they have to figure out a way just to finish those games, get them over and done with, and then rest, and then take a break, suspend the Champions League or Europa League for a little time until we know what's going on. What do you think, Kartik?
I go back and forth on this. I mean, I think that there's definitely some sense that you don't want to watch matches in front that don't have the atmosphere and don't have the energy from the crowd. I mean, let's face it, the leagues we say we like the best, or at least I say I like the best, are the Premier League and Bundesliga, and those have much more vibrant crowd interactions than La Liga or Serie A or Liga A usually. And if I prefer watching a team in La Liga, it's Valencia, because Valencia, other than obviously Tuesday Champions League, has the best home support of top teams in Spain. And then when we talk about Major League Soccer, I'm always saying, well, Portland and Seattle is what I enjoy watching, and it's because of the crowds, and it's because of the energy, and it's because of the enthusiasm. This all having been said, I think there is going to be an absence of entertainment options. We're entering an era of social distancing. The president of the United States says it's a temporary era. I think it may be a little more than temporary, maybe several months. So at some point, you're going to run out of Netflix shows and other entertainment options, and you're going to turn back to football. And you're just going to have to adjust your viewing preferences to football, or whether if you're a basketball fan, let's say the NBA resumes at this moment when we're recording. Let's remind people they've suspended the season. I think they'll resume it at some point. They'll just run longer, right? It'll just run into the summer. Mm-hmm. So I think that we're going to adjust our viewing preferences, Chris. I agree with you that I think most football fans aren't like us and won't geek out and will just be like, hey, we don't want to watch it. But I think you might have no choice because there won't be other entertainment options. Now, the question for me, Chris, is once we're through this, does it change the personal preferences of viewers of soccer? And that's something we'll have to explore as we get there.
Yeah, to me, at the end of the day, Kartik, it's not so much about the viewing preferences or what we're demanding, or we, the soccer fans, or we, the viewers, are wanting. It really is down to the leagues and the clubs, and then based on what their decisions are, then we have to react accordingly. So, for example, like I mentioned, Serie A, La Liga suspended the leagues for a few weeks at least. You look at the Premier League, that as of recording has not they postponed one game, but have not said anything in terms of suspending the league.
Well, they postponed the Arsenal-Man City game.
Yeah, but that was because of an outbreak from the Olympiacos owner, and who had come into contact with some of the Arsenal.
Right. I should mention that same owner is the owner of Nottingham Forest, and He was at the Forest Millwall game, which was one of the games I watched this week. So I think that in the Football League, it's probably coming, maybe even quicker than the Premier League. But go ahead.
But what I'm saying, though, too, is really what this comes down to, just like with anything, all these discussions, even with the U.S. Women's National Team and the U.S. Soccer Federation and the Premier League and the coronavirus and these games being played behind closed doors, it all comes down to money. It all comes down to revenue. All comes down to the business side of things. And for a La Liga or Serie A to go ahead and suspend, yes, it's going to hurt them. But Major League Soccer, I mean, and actually the Premier League too. I mean, most of the revenue that comes in from the Premier League is from TV revenue. So that is revenue that's already in the bank that, yes, they have to go ahead and fulfill the contractual obligations in terms of having those games played in order to meet the contracts, stipulation of 380 games a season and at these times, etc. Major League Soccer, though, Kartik, as of recording again, are focusing on prevention in terms of having sanitizers at games, etc. Most of their revenue is based on ticket revenue. So, yes, they have sponsorships, which are a large portion too, but a lot of it is based on game day, match day revenue. TV revenue at this point is still not as big as all the other leagues out there, all the other major leagues out there. So MLS really is in a tough spot because if they suspend the league for 3 months, say, that is going to have a huge impact on America's top flight league in this country. So, Kartik, what do you think? I mean, to me, you would think that MLS, especially with the NBA suspending the league, that in the next 24 hours that Major League Soccer would say, okay, we're suspending the league too. But for them, it has bigger ramifications.
Yeah, and USL also. I think USL, there are a number of USL teams that are in areas that have been impacted by the coronavirus. And for MLS, so we have this game in Fort Lauderdale that I know you're going to. I won't be going to. The season opener or the home opener for Inter, David Beckham's team in Fort Lauderdale. Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, came to Fort Lauderdale specifically to discuss coronavirus on Saturday. So it's strange that MLS now, as we record this again, we're recording this Thursday morning U.S. time, has not at least postponed that game because there was a reason he came specifically to Fort Lauderdale. We've had a death here. I live in Broward County. We've had a death in Broward County. We've had a couple of other cases in Broward County. I was on TalkSport earlier this week, Chris, to discuss the potential impact in the football league, and specifically in League One and League Two. Not in the championship where there's more TV revenue, and not in the although actually the TV revenue is the same, but in League One and League Two, where those clubs are especially dependent on ticket revenue. And if England closes doors, the Football League has to play the rest of the season with closed doors. I hadn't really thought about MLS and USL until I had that discussion on air on TalkSport, obviously an English broadcaster, about what happens in lower divisions in England. Because I think it's very similar to what would happen here in the U.S. with all our football leagues or all our soccer leagues, because we are overly dependent on ticket revenue, and TV is not a big portion of the revenue. Sponsorship for USL teams isn't a big portion of the revenue. It's mostly ticket revenue. And what came out of the discussion on TalkSport was that League One and League Two will be disproportionately hurt. Those clubs will be put at a competitive disadvantage, maybe not against each other, obviously, because they're all in the same boat, but against championship clubs and Premier League clubs in the football landscape for maybe a number of years after, because they're going to have to climb out of this. That's the same situation, I think, with the clubs here in the U.S. So will they hesitate because of that? Yes. Is that responsible? No. So they have to think about the PR hit about continuing to play. Mm-hmm. So optically now it becomes very difficult for MLS because the NBA has suspended play. NCAA has gone behind closed doors, which is essentially cutting out ticket revenue. Yeah. Now we know the tournament, and as someone who's been a college basketball fan, I for years now the tournament has been more TV driven than ticket revenue driven, but still. And then they're in a sport where there are games being canceled or being played by behind closed doors all the time now. We talked about Dortmund, Schalke, but then the 3 games we mentioned, Atalanta and Valencia, etc. That many of the viewers who watch Major League Soccer have already seen this. So I think PR-wise, they're in a very tough spot. It's Thursday morning by the time People listen to this, it might be dated, but I think they're going to have to pull the trigger in the next 24 hours and at the very least go behind closed doors, if not start just canceling games.
Yeah, and so far they've postponed 2 games, which were the in a couple of weeks from now, the San Jose and Seattle home games. But that was because of local governments saying, okay, we can't have mass gatherings in those areas, and I mean, there's no games, sports games, for example, going on. So that was Major League Soccer reacting to that, where they're basically forced into postponing those games. They may play some of these games behind closed doors, but I mean, there goes the ticket revenue, especially a lot of clubs too with walk-up ticket sales. This is going to have a dramatic impact on Major League Soccer, and it's the worst possible timing, especially with the upcoming TV deal that's going to, they've already had discussions, but the bidding won't start until next year. But this season, more than any other for Major League Soccer, is a pivotal season in order for them to go ahead and strengthen the TV numbers and show that there is an uptick and there is growth and that there's a renewed optimism and enthusiasm about Major League Soccer. And we saw from the opening weekend of Major League Soccer TV ratings, which were good. They were strong. Second week, okay, nothing special really. And now we're going into the third week where there's going to be a lot of question marks about, are these games even going to be played? If they are played, are they going to be played behind closed doors? If they are played behind closed doors, does that lower the TV viewing? And I think it does. I think for the most people, most soccer fans are going to be less interested in watching a game where there's no one in the stadium, because you do feel disconnected. You do feel like, I mean, why should I continue watching this game when there's you want to have that, even if it's through television or streaming, you want to have that human to human contact. You want to feel that you belong. And when you're watching something inside an empty stadium, you don't get that at all. The other thing, Kartik, I would mention too is that we have to think about the TV networks too, because you look at, say, beIN Sports just as one example, and we know that they've been going through tough financial times. They've lost their 2 biggest distributors a couple of years ago, DirecTV and Comcast. So they're losing millions in potential revenue that they would have gotten otherwise. And you look at subscriber fees and people subscribing to beIN Sports, but when you have no La Liga for 2 weeks, maybe potentially more, do consumers think, okay, well, maybe I'll cancel beIN Sports, because other than La Liga, I mean, what else is on beIN Sports of value? And I mean, yes, some people watch Ligue 1, but we've seen the numbers for that have been really, really low. And not just beIN Sports, you can look across all the TV networks. You can look at NBCSN if they go ahead and suspend the Premier League season. So are people going to tune in as much as they would have done in the past? No, because what's on? They might have some classic footage. They might have some interviews. They might have some basically evergreen content that they'll show. But people are going to watch those live sports far less than what they did before. So this whole coronavirus has huge ramifications across the entire industry, at the league level, at the club level, at the broadcaster level, and at the fan level. This could really, really disrupt the entire soccer industry.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, interestingly enough, I mean, as we're monitoring this coronavirus situation, and I'm watching a lot of cable news again. I know I pledged earlier in the week to not watch cable news, but then events overcome you. I'm noticing CNN, a lot of conversation about the NBA, a lot of conversation about Donald Trump's response, etc. BBC, very similar from a more global perspective. But what I found interesting is this morning watching the BBC, their ticker is mostly coronavirus related, but when they get to sport, and as we're recording this, we're getting to sport right now. They talk about coronavirus in the NBA, coronavirus in La Liga. Then they turn to Megan Rapinoe, and consistently every 5 to 7 minutes, it's looping through. Rapinoe does not buy apology from U.S. soccer president. So one, I think as coronavirus shuts down sports, we're going to see more conversation about topics like this. And two, I think it just reminds us this fight that the U.S. women have embarked on with U.S. soccer over equality is not just being watched in the U.S. among soccer fans. It's being watched globally among people who follow sport and follow maybe politics as well. It's pretty fascinating to me because I have noticed also the UK press the last 6 to 9 months has been all over covering the U.S. women's national team's fight, as I'm sure you've noticed too, Chris. So it's a big story, and I think the timing is very bad for U.S. soccer now because things are shutting down elsewhere. And now this gives more people more time to talk about it, not just here in the U.S., but in the U.K. and everywhere else as well.
Yeah, especially after winning She Believes Cup and of course the morale level among fans supporting the U.S. women's national team, especially after recent World Cup wins, is probably at an all-time high. And at the same time, the morale level or confidence level in U.S. soccer is, I wouldn't even say probably, is definitely at an all-time low, both on the men's side and on the way that they've handled the whole women's situation. And like you said, Kartik, this is worst timing possible for the U.S. Soccer Federation because if there are soccer shows happening in the next week, or ESPN FC does a daily show, right? So if there's nothing to talk about in terms of some of the games being suspended from Serie A, La Liga, potentially other leagues too, what else do you talk about? Well, you've got, say, a good 30 minutes where you can focus in a deep dive into all of these legal issues and the both sides and the arguments. I can see this going on for a while, Kartik. Now, Kartik, before we head on to the news, I do want to mention a couple of things in terms of some of the games I watched this past week. Of course, 15, 16 games, lots of games from around the world, different leagues, different channels, etc. You mentioned before the Forest Millwall game that was on the Friday. That was one of my games of the week. Millwall, just hugely impressive display in terms of going 3-0 up by halftime at the City Ground for Nottingham Forest. Kevin Keating's on the commentary. I really enjoyed this one. Millwall with a very Route 1 football style, which really, just a huge pressure on Forest in terms of the style that Millwall was playing. I enjoyed this one, but just moving into a couple of things too, Kartik. The Man City game. This one I didn't watch the game on television, but listened to the match radio commentary on Premier League Live from Talk Sport, and I've mentioned this in the last few weeks too, but TalkSport's radio commentary is so poor. In this match, you had Paul Parker co-commentating, and the way that they commentate games is that it seems to be that they're calling it off the television set. So you hear lots of like where the ball almost goes into the net, but they're not describing what's happening. It's almost like they're reacting to a near miss or a shot that was blocked or whatever it was. But for the radio viewer who does not have access to the television set, I don't know what's going on. And worst case, the worst example of this was near the end of the game. The commentator mentioned that Edison came off his line, and Paul Parker, and then the United scored. Paul Parker, the co-commentator, went further by saying something to the effect of what Edison did just then is criminal by doing what he did. But he didn't describe what he did. There was no explanation of why it was criminal, or even what it was that he did that was criminal. And so for the radio viewer or the radio listener, like myself, I'm left stranded. I'm like, okay, well, what happened? Yes, he came off his line, but did he come off his line too fast, or did he even came off his line and went to the side, or did he slip, or whatever happened? For the radio viewer, I had no idea, and I just left. I was at the end of the game, and I felt like I missed something. I felt left out. And Kartik, I watched the DC United Inter Miami game. This one on Univision and 2DN. Oh my God, the camera positions at Audi Field for DC United are horrible. It looks like you're watching this game from outer space. I mean, the players. On the field from the cameras, they look like tiny little figures running around the pitch. Again, this is not Univision's fault. This is not 2DN's fault. This is just the way they designed the stadium and where they have the cameras positioned. but really, really not a good look for the TV viewer. And again, too, it makes you feel that you're not part of the experience. It makes you feel disconnected, and did not work well for me at all. Actually, my favourite game of the week, Kartik, it was probably Liverpool against Atleti. Just a really, really good game in terms of Atleti, very almost like Italian-minded, very defensive, a low block, and Liverpool just going at it. And Atleti with a fantastic performance in this one, pulling off a huge victory at Anfield on a Champions League night. But what I will mention, Kartik, is that one of the things, and I love English commentators, but one of the things that always leaves me with a little bit of a bitter taste in my mouth is when they're commentating the Champions League and it's an English team, and if the other team's winning, which in this case, Atleti, I mean, what an incredible result this was. That you can notice, it's a very noticeable in terms of their enthusiasm level. In this case, was Clive Tilsley, dropped a huge amount when it was Atleti winning this game. It looked like Atleti was going to win it. The excitement level came out of the broadcast.
Even when there was a goal scored that was disallowed at the end of the 90 or in the end of stoppage time of regular time, he was now you could say he may have been hesitating with the call because of the reactions of some of the Atleti players, but it was just this, Atleti smash and grab, they win, and then the goal was disallowed. But then I sensed it throughout the extra time period, and I have to go back to last year, I believe it was, when the English press jumped on Gary Lineker with incredible ferocity because he said he was rooting for Barcelona against an English club, he being a former Barcelona player. And that left a very poor taste in my mouth, and I think I began to scrutinize English commentary of games involving English clubs in Europe versus non-English clubs a little more at that moment. And I noticed it yesterday with Tilsley. I've noticed it a couple times this season, actually.
Yeah.
Or a couple times since the Lineker was called out for that, which bothers me.
And it's not Clive. I mean, Clive was just the example in this one match. It's pretty much almost all English football commentators is when your English team is winning in the Champions League, that level of enthusiasm, that level of excitement goes up, to a 9 or 10. But when it's Atleti, winning at Anfield, which is a huge victory, and some great goals, some great displays by Atleti, that enthusiasm level is probably at, like, say, a 5 or a 6. It definitely drops. And if Liverpool had bounced back towards the end of this game and scored maybe a late goal to pull it back, you can imagine that their excitement levels would have gone up higher too. But in many ways, it does seem natural for an English commentator to commentate that way. It's just for the world feed and for the world audience listening in, is that if you're an Atleti fan, you feel kind of almost like, come on, guys, this is a big victory. Let's get excited. I can understand why Clive would be less than enthusiastic with Atleti winning, but just for the global audience, it could have been better by having somebody that Clive or whoever it was had more enthusiasm for the underdog winning in this case. Kartik, before we move on to the TV streaming news, anything else you want to point out from your TV viewing and watching this past week?
No, I mean, I thought obviously from an entertainment standpoint, the best match of the week was Valencia and Atalanta, two attack-minded teams. Atalanta, I have said repeatedly, I think for the last however long, is the best team to watch in Europe, and I'm going to miss watching them for the next month, right? Yeah. At least. So that I would add to the matches you mentioned. Forest and Millwall was a phenomenal performance, great first half really to watch, and then I would include Liverpool, Atleti in that. So I think we have basically the same games that we enjoyed this week.
All right, let's move on to TV streaming news, and a long-awaited announcement has come through, and we finally heard the official confirmation from NWSL for their league this season and their TV contract and their TV schedule. It finally came out, Kartik.
Yeah, so opening weekend of the NWSL season, assuming it proceeds as planned, we have to say that about everything now, there will be a match CBS over the air. So that will be the first over the air CBS broadcast of soccer that I believe since the 1970s when they showed the NASL. That weekend there will also be 2 more matches available on CBS All Access, and throughout the course of the season there will be matches available on CBS All Access and on Twitch, which of course is a streaming platform. As well, there will be several matches, basically a match a week more or less, or a match every 2 weeks on CBS Sports Network. The NWSL Championship game will be, which has been nomadic, right? It's gone from Fox to Lifetime to ESPN, ESPN2, excuse me, will now be shown on CBS over the air. So that's very, very exciting. Great breakthrough for women's football, women's soccer on network television in the United States. Again, if things proceed as planned, which is a big if with everything I think going on in the world.
So this one is a little bit tricky though, Kartik, because so like you mentioned, the opening game of the season on CBS and then the finals on CBS. They're expecting a few more games to be announced on CBS2 throughout the season, but CBS is available for over the air. Or even if on streaming services, whether it's Fubo or Hulu plus Live TV or AT&T Now, YouTube TV, etc. So CBS is very accessible. The vast majority of games are going to be on CBS All Access, which is CBS's proprietary streaming service, and I think that's about $10 a month. So, and also with the UEFA Champions League going to CBS All Access beginning in the summer of 2021, we're going to be using CBS All Access more and more than we have done in the past, for sure. And then some of the games are on CBS Sports Network, which is less available, but you can get that through streaming services such as Fubo and Hulu plus Live TV and others. The challenge is, though, Kartik, is that CBS All Access does not have access to every single NWSL game. So in order to get all the games, you would have to. I mean, again, it depends if you're a cord cutter or if you're a cable TV subscriber. You may have to look at the plan that you have in place and go, okay, does it have CBS Sports Network? Yes, it will have CBS, but then you have to go ahead and get CBS All Access in addition to whatever you have currently.
And All Access is also showing the matches that are on CBS over the air, those 2 matches. But I have the release from NWSL, right? And from what I could surmise, they're not showing the matches on CBS Sports Network. Correct. Yeah. So there's a separate. So yeah, so good news, but you definitely want to do some planning if you do want to watch or have access to all those games beforehand, just to make sure that you can get those. Second piece of news this week, Kartik, and this is coming in. I'll have a full report at worldsoccertalk.com in the next 24 hours that'll go into a lot more detail. But coming up is the CONMEBOL World Cup qualifiers, which begin in near the end of March. Involve all the nations from the southern hemisphere in South America and competing in effectively a tournament to go ahead and to qualify, to see who qualifies for the 2022 World Cup. Now, there's always a possibility of a postponement. I think CONMEBOL has asked FIFA if it's possible to postpone these games due to the coronavirus outbreak. But whether that happens or not, what I found out just before recording this podcast is that the rights to the CONMEBOL World Cup qualifiers have been purchased by a company in the United States, and they will only be available via pay-per-view. So pay-per-view, which seems like it's going back in time into the 90s when we had to watch a lot of games on pay-per-view. But for the CONMEBOL World Cup qualifiers, each game is going to be $30 each. Oh, man.
Yeah. So I think they will offer some type of plan where if you want to subscribe and get access to all of the World Cup qualifiers, there will be a discount. And there might be...
What about one for, let's say I'm a fan of Paraguay and I want to watch all their matches? Is there
$30 each.
Oh, my goodness.
I know. So yeah, again, we'll have more details at worldsoccertalk.com in the next 24 hours. By the time you listen to this podcast, it'll probably be up there. But anyway, that's late breaking news, and I think we have the exclusive on that one. Kartik, moving on to the next news item. This is something that came up in your news column. We didn't get a chance to mention it last week when we were recording at the Todo NA studio, but a piece of information in regards to coverage of soccer in the US.
Yeah, so Arlo White, who's the lead commentator for NBC's Premier League coverage, will be coming to the United States during the summer. Again, if things proceed as planned, have to give that caveat with everything in coronavirus era, to be the lead commentator for the Chicago Fire MLS team, which is involved in a massive reboot right now. They're moving back to Soldier Field after 15 years in the suburbs, more than 15 years in the suburbs. And Arlo White is going to be the play-by-play voice. Now, he did that for the Seattle Sounders, remember, before he moved to NBC. And he moved to NBC to cover MLS, to call MLS games initially. And then, obviously, they got the Premier League rights. NBC then dropped MLS, went back to Fox, and he's called the Premier League based in the UK since. So he has a lot of experience with Major League Soccer, and will be coming back during the summer to call some Major League Soccer matches. Yeah,
I think for Arlo, this is a better fit for him in regards to calling Chicago Fire games in terms of the commentating style with Major League Soccer, which is a lot more talkative, which is a lot more going off in different tangents. And I think that would be something that would probably be more acceptable to a Chicago Fire or MLS audience. Having said that, though, too, I mean, it's going to be limited in terms of the number of games he's going to be doing. He's going to be going to Tokyo to commentate the some of the Olympic games, soccer games for NBC, and then of course the Premier League season starts back up again in August. So it won't be a full-time job. There'll be another commentator filling in for when he's not available. But no, I think Arlo going to Chicago is a good fit for him. Last but not least, Kartik, this is the last news item, but this is a huge one that has huge ramifications, as did the coronavirus, or as it does, is that the Premier League and the English Football League are discussing getting rid of the blackout window. So in the UK, the 3 o'clock until I think it's 5:15 UK time, there's a blackout window where no soccer at all from anywhere around the world, especially local, British soccer, cannot be televised or shown in the United Kingdom. And the reason this was done was really to make sure that television didn't impact match attendances. And we're at a time right now, Kartik, where that could change. There's been discussion about going ahead and temporarily getting rid of this blackout window in order to allow fans to go ahead and watch games through TV, and if they're not able to go to the games, whether it's a behind closed doors game or if it's a club or a league saying that we're trying to limit the number of people going to games, this could change the entire soccer industry in the UK. What are you hearing on this one, Kartik?
Yeah, I'm hearing a fair amount, a lot flying the last few days. And again, this might be dated. There might be an announcement by the time you were listening to this podcast. I'm hearing that this is the major bone of contention in rolling out something with potential government involvement in the rest of the season in the Football League and the Premier League in terms of coronavirus. So two things. One, if you play matches behind closed doors, how do season ticket holders access seeing those matches if the matches are blacked out in that window, the 3 to 5:15 window? Two, Sky and BT Sport they're not as accessible as channels are in the United States, for instance. So, and again, Chris, we talk about this a lot on this show, and I think a lot in the U.S. audience don't know how difficult it is to access Premier League games in the UK. So what is done about that? Will there be matches streamed on club websites, and will there be an authentication required that says, hey, I'm a Manchester City season ticket holder, I'm going to the MCFC, to the City website, so I can watch the match at Eastlands against whomever because it's closed doors. So that's being discussed. But the 3 to 5:15 window seems to be the biggest bone of contention, Chris, and what to do about that if you start playing matches behind closed doors. Does that mean you start broadcasting immediately, starting potentially as early as this weekend, or maybe next weekend, more realistically, in the UK, given that there is a prohibition on that? Is this an extenuating stance where you lift that 3 o'clock kickoff broadcast ban? And if that's the case, do you just extend that into the future, into the next set of TV contracts? So a lot about the future of British football, or English football, on television may be determined in the next week just based on the reaction to coronavirus, because it seems like some precedents that we've had in place might get overturned, and they're the same precedents that people have called for to be overturned for a number of years.
So I have two big issues with this, Kartik. The first issue is technological. I'm not confident that even if the Premier League said, okay, we're suspending, well, actually, we're going to play games behind closed doors for the next, say, 3 weeks, for example, I am not confident that they could actually pull that off. And if they say, okay, these games, I mean, if they stream any of these games, so those games it'd be better fit for them to go ahead and have that on television. So where they're experts at broadcasting soccer on television, and whether it's on the BBC or ITV, having those games available for soccer fans to watch. Again, I'm against it in terms of just it's not the same. But again, it's a league decision of what they decide to do. If they stream the games, I mean, they're not set up to do that. They don't have the experience in having 50,000 people, 100,000 people or more. I mean, or we might be talking about close to 1 million people hitting a website at the same exact time, or hitting an app at the same exact time to watch a game. So they would have to partner with some of the streaming providers out there, maybe the Amazons of the world, or other broadcasters, to make sure that it's not a technological disaster where fans are wanting to watch the games and they just can't because the site crashes or whatever it may be. The second big issue I have with this, Kartik, is that it could be no turning back. If they decide to go down this path and say, okay, we're going to make these games available during that blackout window, we're going to have those games on television behind closed doors and or available through streaming too, is it sets a precedent. Fans, who knows how long this virus is going to continue. It could set a precedent where fans get used to watching these games through TV and or streaming, and once the virus is over, the issue is over, we're back to normal, is at that time people might say, like, well, why can't I continue to watch these games on television? And why can't I continue to be able to stream these games if I want to? And yes, there'll be enough people to go to the games to have the attendances be full match attendances, but why am I not allowed to watch these games as I've done in the past? So this really could change the whole English soccer platform. Effectively, this has huge ramifications across the entire industry, just as the coronavirus could have huge implications on Major League Soccer. All right, Kartik, let's move on to TV ratings. We have a new world record. We have a new record for the most watched Premier League match live on US television ever. And that was Manchester United against Manchester City this past weekend. It was on Sunday on NBC, also on Telemundo and digital. And then combined, that number, the average viewing number for those broadcasts was 1.76 million. Which was greater than the previous record, which was, I think, 1.72 million, again, for a Manchester derby, and was greater than Fox's record for Liverpool against Chelsea, which was on tape delay, and that was, I think, 1.64 million. So a brand new record. To me, Kartik, I think I'd say there was two factors in why this was such a huge number. One is that the game was on NBC instead of NBCSN on a Sunday at 12:30. So they took advantage of the time change to have the game an hour later when there's more people watching. And the second thing is, I think it's a resurgence with Manchester United, and more a belief in that club that fans are tuning back in. Of course, this is a big game anyway, but fans are tuning back in and feel more confident right now United and maybe for the rest of the season.
Yeah, I think that this is an important bump for NBC, because even though United qualified for the Champions League a couple times under Van Gaal and Mourinho, there was just a bad feeling, a bad vibe around the club. NBC took over the Premier League rights the year the year after Ferguson had retired, and Manchester United has not been the same since. I think Solskjaer, even if they finish 5th or 6th this year, there's a different feeling around that club, and Manchester United fans are excited. Manchester United fans in the States are excited, and I think it's a good time for NBC, because United under Solskjaer, legend at the club, and Chelsea under Lampard, legend at the club. Both clubs are on the up. Both clubs have a nice young core they've developed and could be competing for Premier League titles as early as next season, potentially, both those clubs. So I think this is very big news for NBC, and reflective. The rating from this week is reflective of that resurgence of Manchester United.
Yeah, and you have to wonder too, again, with the coronavirus and more people having to being forced to work from home. I mean, and telecommuting, is whether that will actually help increase the viewing figures for games where, the crowd is there and the game is on and it's a big game. So, for example, Monday's game, Liverpool against Everton, potentially, depending what City does this weekend, that could be an opportunity for Liverpool to win the title on Monday on a mid-afternoon game in the US, where mostly people are working in the offices, but maybe there'll be a lot more people at home. Pumas against Club America in Liga MX. This was on Friday night. This one had this had a big viewing number too. It was 1.6 million people watched this game on Univision and Tuduene. Huge number there. So both with the Premier League and the Manchester derby, and then the Pumas against America derby too. Big numbers there. Elsewhere, we look at the second week of Major League Soccer, and all of the numbers are not available yet, so we don't know what that DC United Inter Miami number was on Univision and Tuduene. We will get that in the next 24 to 48 hours, and we'll post that at worldsoccertalk.com. But the other MLS games that we did see in terms of numbers, we had the biggest number as available right as of the moment was 399,000 viewers for Portland against Nashville on ESPN on Sunday, which, looking back at the 2019 season in Major League Soccer, that definitely is an increase from the average that ESPN had on MLS last season. So positive numbers there. And then we have LAFC against Philadelphia Union on FS1 on Sunday night. And this game was on Fox, FS1 and Fox Deportes. Those two numbers combined was 236,000 viewers for that. So that was hurt really by the late kickoff, 10:30 p.m. Eastern time for the 3-3 game. Yeah, FS1, it still struggles with those late Sunday night broadcasts in terms of viewing numbers. Kartik, moving on to listener mailbag. Rico Richardson says, I don't think promotion relegation could really work from a American TV perspective. A team like Charleston Battery in Major League Soccer probably wouldn't bring big numbers nationally compared to a Charlotte. And while I understand where he's coming from, but to me, it's not about the TV market. TV market is important, especially in the United States, definitely. But as we've seen with the New York TV market for Major League Soccer has been weak. The LA market for MLS has been weak. These are the two biggest metropolitan cities in the United States. And if you look at the Premier League, if you have a Bournemouth or a Sheffield United, we've seen games between Bournemouth and Sheffield United, which probably have two of the smallest fan bases in the United States. And they've had greater viewing numbers for games featuring the Bournemouth against, I think, Sheffield United than for a lot of Major League Soccer games. So it's not, and obviously these viewers in the United States are not from Sheffield and they're not from Bournemouth. So I think it's more of a US thing in terms of the markets. But then there's no guarantee that that number is going to be big because of the market they're in. I think promotion relegation helps, but I don't know. Anyways, I don't agree with Rico's comment there, Kartik. I don't know if you disagree either.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that, which has been generally the case against promotion and relegation from people pushing back in this country, which is, oh, what happens if LA versus New York is in the second division and you have Charleston versus Rochester in the first division? But I think TV numbers adjust, and I think as time goes on, you see even in the mainstream American sports, I mean, the teams that have the biggest followings aren't necessarily from the biggest TV markets. So the Green Bay Packers have arguably the biggest following among any NFL team. I don't have hard data to back that up, but that's just my intuition because I don't really follow the NFL. I don't follow the NFL. That's clearly not a very big market, right? Television market, and then I think you could keep going with that in other sports, right? And I know for years the St. Louis Cardinals had one of the biggest followings I could find in terms of baseball teams. Now, there's a lot of history behind that particular MLB franchise, National League franchise, but that's not a big TV market. So I think there are exceptions to this. And also want to point out that I think if you have an up and down pro rel system, you will probably have more teams that are in big markets in the lower divisions than you do now, that are well funded, that are well financed. And also would mention that we have more big markets, more dispersed metropolitan populations in the United States than we do anywhere than they do anywhere in Western Europe, other than maybe Germany. So there are a lot of cities that could support a first division team that don't have a first division team here. That's not necessarily the case in Europe, where pro-rel does work.
I would look at an example such as Leicester City. I mean, Leicester City without promotion relegation would not be in the Premier League. Leicester City went ahead and won the Premier League. Incredible season, just such a inspiring display that season to win it. Yet Leicester is not a big city in the United Kingdom, but I'm sure US-wise too, and globally and in England, viewing figures for Leicester City games were way, way up. Not because they were from the size of the city, not because of... it's because they played good football and they had been promoted over, a period of years to get into the Premier League and were entertaining. I guess at the end of the day, it's all about entertainment, and promotion relegation does enhance entertainment. It makes it more exciting. It makes it more of a reason to tune into games, even if it's clubs near the bottom. And the city size should not be as big of an impact on those numbers at the end of the day. Yes, it will have an influence, but it is not the only reason. Next up is Robert. Robert says the MLS games in the first week were very competitive, no big blowouts. This could make for an exciting season. It is not true that almost all teams make the playoffs. It's about half. Is that worse than having more than half the teams in the Premier League be forever in the bottom half? The setup in the US is and will continue to be different than Europe. All sports here have playoffs, so why not let that fact alone? So, Kartik, why does MLS have playoffs?
Because that's the American way, I guess. And I think the other thing is that because they now have so many teams, they can't balance their schedule, right? And you'll play teams in your conference 3 times, and you'll play teams in the other conference once. Now, actually, starting this year, you may not even play them at all. So that's the case for playoffs. But I think initially, when you had 10 or 12 teams, you could have much more easily balanced the schedule and had a single table. This having been said, I have some sympathy for the playoff argument in the unbalanced schedule in Major League Soccer because I think, one, you want to develop more local rivalry. So you want teams geographically closer to one another, playing each other more. And two, I think the travel is prohibitive in MLS. I think it affects the level of play. There are a lot of factors I think critics of MLS, particularly Eurocentric critics, whether they're in Europe or they're in the US, they're Eurocentric, don't understand, which is playing through the summer is the hottest months of the year affects quality of play, and the amount of travel in MLS affects the level of play. All things being equal, if MLS was played in England, I don't know how it would look. It might look a lot better than it does as a television product. So, but that's the reason they had playoffs to begin with.
Well, and going back to that question about why does Major League Soccer even have playoffs, and you're right, Kartik, it is because it's a traditional American model. I think really, I mean, especially when Major League Soccer launched back in the late 90s, it was, I mean, even the name MLS is very similar to MLB. It's a very American-centric setup in terms of the way that it's run. It's very similar to the NFL model. But to me, I mean, one of the reasons they probably had playoffs in the very beginning was because it's easier to sell to the TV broadcasters. So when they go into a meeting, this is going back in the 90s, late 90s, going into a meeting with ABC executives who may not have known soccer that well or known kind of the intricacies of soccer, it would have been much easier for Major League Soccer to say, hey, here's what we're recommending, here's what we're thinking. We're thinking about having a regular season, just like Major League Baseball, and then we're going to have the playoffs. And not only do we have the playoffs, but we're going to have the World Series of soccer, and we're going to call it the MLS Cup. And so for a TV broadcaster, that is something that, it sounds familiar. It sounds like it would work. Why wouldn't it work? That model, to me, is flawed, because it is one of those things that, why then do you tune in to watch a regular season? For the most part, yes, there's going to be some interesting games, interesting matchups, but it takes the focus away from the regular season and puts it on the actual playoffs, which would be okay to a certain extent, except that the playoffs are played during the season, when the part of the season when college football and NFL football are starting to heat up. And so then for the vast majority of American sports fans, they're distracted. It's hard to focus in on the soccer as much as they did during the spring or summer, now that it's heating up for the World Series, and then you've got the NFL and college football getting ready to start up or playing games. So to me, the calendar is a big factor in limiting Major League Soccer's ability to be more successful. But that's why I think this playoffs is, because it was something that was comfortable, it was something that was familiar, it was something that didn't require much thought. Let's just copy a model used in other sports in America and then see if that works. Last but not least, Shane Rowe says, and this is a good one for you, Kartik, comment for your next podcast. Is it any coincidence that it's only the Bundesliga who have educational videos with narration on technique and tactics of individual clubs in the league on its YouTube channel? In fact, it has teamed up with Tifo Football to produce some videos. The other top 4 leagues don't. They only show highlight reels and sensational plays with music. Does it have something to do with German football philosophy?
That's a really good question, because I've watched those videos. I'm a subscriber to Tifo Football. Actually, the second they have a video that comes out, I generally watch it within the next day or two. So I've enjoyed these, but I hadn't really thought about the fact that no one else does them. No other leagues do them. So, Shane, thank you very much for pointing that out. I think it probably does have something to do with German football philosophy and why they're always kind of on the cutting edge of things in terms of playing style, in terms of nutrition, in terms of also the way they present the sport. So, thank you. Yeah, I've been watching those videos, but had not actually thought that no one else is doing them, but that's true. No one else is doing them.
Yeah, and going back to Shane's question, I would say that, the Premier League, as one example, is definitely more of a marketing machine, where it's more of the hype factor and more the clips and showing the goal highlights and you mean the soap opera and those things that are more interesting to, say, the mainstream soccer fan. While I would argue that for the Bundesliga, it's very much a purist football league in terms of football as it's meant to be, which is the Bundesliga slogan, which is very focused on that side of things in terms of more the technical side, similar to La Liga in many ways. And that's probably why that the German league is looking at doing more of those focused videos on the hardcore of the hardcore. Not to say that the Premier League doesn't have hardcore fans either, but it's different. It's a different style that the Bundesliga has than the Premier League. And not to say one's better than the other, but they are very, very different. Good comment there, Shane Rowe. And Shane gets our letter of the week in terms of the listener mailbag there. So we want you to have your say. You can always reach us via email through web at worldsoccertalk.com, as well as facebook.com/worldsoccertalk, and on Twitter at worldsoccertalk. Plus, of course, you can post your comments on worldsoccertalk.com. Now, Kartik, you and I, no matter what happens, knock on wood, hopefully, with the coronavirus and everything that's happening in the world of soccer, we will be back here every week talking about what's happening, talking about how things are affecting the TV broadcast industry and the streaming industry, even if there are no games on or even if there are games played behind closed doors. You and I will, of course, be watching as much soccer as we can, possibly. And if there's no soccer on, I'm sure there's a lot of television coverage, soccer documentaries, YouTube videos, and there's so much content out there that's really good. Speaking of content too, coming up, this week's The Heart of the Game podcast that came out on Monday had an interview with Peter Drury, and Peter hardly ever does any interviews and is not on social media. And Nate Abarea had a really good discussion there with Peter. And coming up next week, we have an interview with someone that I know that, Kartik, you appreciate a lot and value in terms of his commentary and presenting skills, and that is Ian Joy. Yeah, one of my favorites and one of the real pioneers for American broadcasters now, being picked up, doing some matches with the World Feed for the Bundesliga, and someone who's done actually a tremendous job with New York City FC also. I think a lot of our listeners they're aware of his work at BN and at Fox, but they may not be aware that he actually calls NYCFC games also in the largest TV market in the United States. Yeah, and he will have some interesting things to say in this podcast that's coming out on Monday. Some things that I didn't know about, and probably a lot of other listeners didn't know about either. So some really, really interesting comments that he has that he's going to share in the next interview. So thank you for listening. You can get a new episode of the World Soccer Talk podcast every Thursday. Every episode is released on all of the different podcast players available, as well as worldsoccertalk.com. If you like the show, share it with your friends on social media and give us a review on iTunes. We'd greatly appreciate it, whether it's positive, negative, or indifferent. We'd love to get your feedback there. And Kartik, heading into another week of football, which might be uncertain week of football. We don't know yet. But hopefully everyone makes the right decisions. Hopefully everyone stays safe. Hopefully everyone's washing their hands and reducing contact and being as safe as possible. And just, being smart, staying at home, and hopefully watching a lot of soccer on television. Other than that, Kartik, what should they do? Enjoy your football.